George III.
By the 1770s, many colonies had become resentful of British rule, which imposed strict control on trade. They began to think that they should only pay taxes approved by their local governing assembly.
Reduced the public debt due to the 7 Years'
At the Boston
War.
Tea Party,
The king
in
introduced new duties
1773,
on corn,
some
paper,
rebels,
and tea,
dressed as Native
which caused
Americans,
fierce
threw the
opposition in
British
the
tea
American colonies.
coming from another part
The
of the
English
British
Parliament
Empire
responded to
India,
the protests by repealing
the
some
Arab.
of them. But
The
tax
rebels
on important
maintained
tea
that the
remained.
taxes were unjust, as the colonies had no political power. They said, no taxation without representation. In England, the philosopher Edmund Burke recognized the justice of their cause, and Thomas Paine's common sense stimulated the desire for a republic. The Americans divided into patriots who wanted independence and loyalists who wanted to remain part of Britain. And the War of Independence began in 1775. The Americans set up an army under the command of George Washington to face the stronger and better trained British army. On 3rd July 1776, in Philadelphia, the Congress, made by representatives from 13 of the colonies, signed the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, a lawyer from Virginia. It was more than a statement that the colonies were a new nation, since it claimed that all men had a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It also states that the governments can only claim the right to rule if they have the approval of those they govern, that is, the consent of the governed. In 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, the British army was defeated and Britain recognized the independence of its former colonies with the Treaty of Versailles in 1783. America became the symbol of a new start, with its virgin territory, where people from all European countries could melt into a new race. The new Republic of the United States of America adopted a federal constitution in 1787, and George Washington became the first president in 1789. The colonists who remained loyal to Britain moved to Canada. After the loss of America, George III had a difficult time with his ministers, until in 1783 he asked William Pitt the Younger to become Prime Minister. Pitt won a majority at an election the following year. He was in office for 18 years, during which he tried to simplify the financial system and reduce the national debt, promote profitable trade and finance, and supported Adam Smith's theory of laissez-faire, illustrated in The Wealth of Nations. Smith's philosophy of economic liberalism encouraged free trade and economic self-interest, and stressed the division of labor. In Ireland, in 1791, a group of Catholics and Protestants founded the Society of United Irishmen, who aimed at forming their own republic. In 1798, they organized an uprising that was crushed by the British troops. To prevent other rebellions, Pitt allowed Irish representatives to sit at Westminster. In 1801, the Act of Union joined Ireland and Britain to form the new United Kingdom. The Irish flag was added to create the Union Jack that is still used today. In the late 1780s, King George III suffered the first attack of what the doctors defined as severe mental confusion. The famous royal madness was actually due to porphyria, a genetic condition. That's why he was called and nicknamed the Mad King. In 1810, George III became totally incapable of reigning, and in 1811, his son George, the future George III, was made Prince Regent. The following period is known as Regency, Meanwhile, in France, in 1789, the principle of social equality of the Enlightenment had led a revolution. In 1792, the French had abolished the monarchy and declared their country a republic. The spirit of intellectual rebellion pervaded the works of the poets. They shared the enthusiasm and the hopes aroused by the revolution, but they were bitterly disillusioned when, in 1793, the royal family and thousands of people considered as enemies of the revolution were executed during a period called the Reign of Terror. Just as the British Parliament was debating how to react to the threat from across the Channel, France declared war on Britain and Holland in 1793. The French had a weak navy but proved unbeatable on land. Much of their success was due to the skill of a general named Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1797, he had defeated much of Europe and was effectively ruling France as a military dictator. However, Napoleon's victories in Europe were balanced by Britain's supremacy at sea. The hero of the British Navy was Admiral Nelson, who was killed at his great victory over the French and Spanish off Cape Trafalgar in 1805. Later, the Duke of Wellington led British soldiers to victories in Portugal. Napoleon, weakened by his disastrous invasion of Russia, surrendered in 1814. His 100 Days in 1815 ended in final defeat at the hands of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. The costs of the war were huge. Soldiers and sailors returned home to discover that bad harvests, high taxation, and industrial changes were causing misery. Increases in the price of bread led to riots in the cities, while in the factories, the so-called Luddites, named after their leader Ned Ludd, smashed new machines which had taken their work away. This unrest frightened the authorities that tried to repress discontent under many laws, allowing arrest without trial, forbidding the combination of working men into trade unions, and silencing the freedom of expression. The most serious incident was at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, where a peaceful crowd who had come to hear the radical Henry Horatio Hunt was fired on by the local militia. So soon after the victory over Napoleon's tyranny at Waterloo, this massacre was ironically named Peterloo. Then the Mad George III died in 1820 and was succeeded by his son George III, the Fourth. He won the title of First Gentleman of Europe for his lavish and extravagant behavior. His taste for the exotic was reflected in the public buildings of the period, like the Royal Pavilion in Brighton and Regent Street in London. In political affairs, he behaved irresponsibly, and he did very little to encourage any social reforms. However, concessions indicative of a new political awareness were made towards the end of 1820s. In 1824, trade unions, the Association of Workers, were legalized. In 1829, the Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel created the Metropolitan Police known as Bobbies, after their founder. This new unarmed force provided an alternative to the army as a means of maintaining public order. When George the Fourth died in 1830, his brother became king as William IV. Whig, the Earl of Grey was the new prime minister. The Whigs wanted to bring in electoral reform, and despite strong opposition, the Great Reform Act was passed in 1832. It extended the vote to almost all male members of the middle class and redistributed seats on more equitable basis in the counties. Parliament abolished slavery in the West Indies in 1833, and in the same year, the Factory Act limited factory employment of children under 9. William IV died in 1837, and his 18-year-old niece, Victoria, succeeded him to the British throne.